talk to me, could you introduce yourself and tell me about Organogenesis?
Sure. So I'm President and Chief Executive Officer of Organogenesis. I've been in this role since December 2003. Prior to that, I spent 11 years at Novartis. So essentially, I grew up in my business career at Novartis, and that's how I got first exposed to regenerative medicine, tissue engineering. Novartis at one time in the 1990s was highly focused in this area and in fact was a partner to Organogenesis.
So could you talk about the journey that Organogenesis has made so far?
Sure. So it's a journey. It's a roller coaster ride, might be a better way to express it. Is the company was initially a spin out of MIT, and so the initial founder was a professor at MIT, Eugene Bell, incorporated in 1985, went public quickly, and by 1998 the company had a market cap as a public company of over $1 billion with no revenue. Just really the company was valued on the great groundbreaking science and the promise of tissue engineering. The challenge arrived when we obtained our first FDA approval, and it was time to value the company not based on the hype and the exciting science, but based on financial fundamentals like revenue and profit. And the company had a tough time transitioning from a research-based company to a commercially oriented company. And as a result, essentially imploded, and we really had to rebuild the company in 2002, 2003. So my remit coming in as CEO in December 2003 was to rebuild the company. What we had was a foundation of great science and FDA approvals, but the challenge was to build a business model around the great science.
So what were the pressure factors that caused the implosion?
I guess I'll try to simplify a little bit, but one of them was that Organogenesis adopted a typical or classical biotech model in the sense that they out-licensed the commercialization rights to a big pharma company. In this example, it was Novartis. And so that was one issue which didn't turn out very well in the end, primarily because the transfer price of the product didn't provide enough revenue for Organogenesis to survive and prosper. So that was one issue. The second issue was one of focus, is that the first groundbreaking product, Apligraf, which was in fact the first allogeneic cell therapy to be approved in any therapeutic area by the FDA, was out the door with Organogenesis, and then the focus within R&D was on to broader, very, very exciting opportunities such as pancreatic islet cells, liver assist device, vascular graft, and so forth. All very promising with a foundation of brilliant science, but when the financial reality hit that we weren't being able to sustain ourselves on the partial revenue of Apligraf, with the lion's share going to Novartis, the research and development had to be pared down, and that was the second issue. And the third issue was one of manufacturing, is that we were not able in version 1.0 of the company to reliably manufacture the product in a volume way at a price point that made economic sense.
Why were the terms of the licensing deal not profitable for Organogenesis?
Well, I think hindsight is always 20/20. I think the expectation was that the cost of goods of manufacturing our cell therapies were going to be driven down by volume. And that is, in fact, something that has been realized recently in version 2.0 of the company. But the deal that was struck with Novartis transferred a certain dollar amount to Organogenesis, and that dollar amount, in fact, was less than the cost of making a unit. So you can imagine the more we sold, the more we lost money. So I think it was a combination of perhaps a contract that could have been better negotiated, but also a manufacturing efficiency that we weren't able to realize initially.
Okay, that's really interesting. And so to rebuild the company that you stepped in, how did that work? What kind of process did you have to undergo for that?
So I think the first thing was that which you would do when you're looking at relaunching any company is you just ask the fundamental questions. What are we passionate about? What do we want to be? What can we be the best in the world at? And what drives our economic engine? So what can we make money at? And the intersection of the answers of those three questions netted out that we had to cull a lot of the research that was already being done and define ourselves more narrowly but more effectively. And we netted out that by delivering allogeneic cells, we believe we can be the best in the world at inducing soft tissue to regenerate with primarily Apligraf, but line extensions from Apligraf. And so inducing soft tissue regeneration is what we do as a company. So that was the first step to relaunching. And then just deciding what are the levers that drive the business. One clearly is manufacturing. It wouldn't matter what we did right if we weren't able to reliably mass produce cell therapies at a price point that makes economic sense for all involved. So viewing manufacturing, the process development, the process engineering, the production as the vital core of the company, and then building up that skill set was essential. And then rather than out-licensing the commercialization to a big pharma company, which didn't really work too well for us, nor did it work well for Dermograph, by the way, to a big device company. So we felt that that skill set better resided in-house, and we made the commitment to build up our sales, marketing, health policy, reimbursement team. And right now, our sales team numbers about 200, and with a pretty sizable reimbursement and marketing program to support it.
Wow, that's really impressive, especially for a smaller company.
Well, it wasn't for lack of trying to out-license, but I think that the key learning was that the skill set within regenerative medicine overlaps with pharmaceuticals and overlaps with medical device, but it's not for nothing that Smith & Nephew and Novartis were not able to properly commercialize this technology. I think that there are a sufficient amount of unique aspects to what's required to integrate cell therapies into the healthcare system that we felt, and Advanced Biohealing felt, and other early pioneers in the field felt that it's better and perhaps a necessity to build up those skill sets ourselves.
Do you talk about those aspects that are different from other therapeutic areas?
Sure. If you go across the value chain, there are very few that are a one-to-one overlap. And you know, one example is the supply chain, the logistics, the shipping and receiving. It's more akin to shipping fresh fish or fresh flowers around the world than it is to a pill with a 6, 12, or 24-month shelf life or a medical device. So the whole infrastructure around getting a living technology from your manufacturing plant to within arm's reach of the clinician, so that in a very convenient, reliable way, is different than what device and pharma companies are akin to. And so I think that the analogy that I use is, if you ask a pharma or device company, could you reliably do this? I think the answer is, of course they could, but it doesn't necessarily fit within their existing processes, and so they would have to be very motivated to build unique, separate processes. And that's why the companies such as Organogenesis and Advanced Biohealing have succeeded, because we've stepped away from any model and we've just asked what is required to build up this technology and to get it to the customer in a convenient way.
The new manufacturing facility must be a significant milestone. What does this signify for your company and the field in general?
Well, so it's a multi-phased expansion. So from 1992 until just a few short years ago, we resided in just across the street from where we are today, 150 Dan Road, which is an 80,000 square foot building. Due to the success of Apligraph and the high growth of the company, as well as the submission of a new cell therapy for periodontal applications, we know that we need to grow, we know we need to expand, and in fact we reached the capacity of our existing building by 2013 or 2014. So the need to expand was clear, and as a result we've acquired 3 other buildings, each within 100 meters of where we're sitting now. So all within a little campus on Dan Road in Canton, just south of Boston. So we've moved into the second building. We've are in the process of refurbishing the third building, but the really complex manufacturing suite is under construction right now. We've acquired the land, we own the building, we've gutted the building, we've completed the engineering designs, we've ordered the long lead time automated equipment. But if you go down the street, you'll see hard hats everywhere. The construction is underway right now.
So that must be quite a milestone for the company. What does this signify?
Well, I think it's very, very important, because in tissue engineering, regenerative medicine, you tend to start out small. And as a result, it's not very often that you get to have a blank sheet of paper and build up a very large global CBER and EMA compatible cell therapy manufacturing site. What we did and what many do is you have a clean room. When you expand, you knock down the wall and build a broader clean room, and so you end up with perhaps a suboptimal design. So this is the first time in our history where we've been able to really start from scratch and really have global regulatory endpoints in mind, and to have a closed system, and to have a system that is as xeno-free as is reasonable and possible, and compartmentalized, meaning there are firewalls between the different manufacturing suites so that we can meet the sometimes disharmonized regulatory needs of different bodies.
Can we talk about your interactions with the regulators? What is it like to deal with the EMA and CBER?
It's very, very complex. I think it might be getting easier because I think the regulators themselves are getting more sophisticated. It wasn't very long ago that the EMA had yet to approve any cell therapy in any therapeutic field. So, there just wasn't the history. CBER is gaining experience. We at Organogenesis have the perhaps the additional complexity of being regulated by many, many different authorities. We're a tissue bank in the US. We're regulated by CDRH, the Device Bureau. We submit through combination products to get routed to where we really belong. And our recent cell therapies that are before the FDA are regulated by CBER as a biologic. And then, of course, because we're thinking globally, everything that we do in clinical and cell banking, process development, keeps an eye on what the EMA needs are. So I think it's very complicated, and we're just trying to meet the highest common denominator of all of the above.
So why is there such differences between the EMA and the FDA?
Primarily just a timing issue. I think that the FDA was speaking at a recent event in Boston, and they made the point that there is a better outreach between FDA and EMA than there has been in the past. But I think it was difficult for the regulators even to decide which body within their own branch would look at these types of technology. And some of the conclusions that the FDA arrived at were viewed through a different lens than EMA, to do with some of the precursors, some of the xeno components, the types of clinical studies, the number of clinical trials. So I think that harmonization will come, and that there is momentum to work better together between the two, Europe and the US. But it's one of the things that you face when you're in a nascent industry, I believe.
Could we talk about the field in general? Where is it heading?
Well, I think a lot of things are changing, and changing fast, and changing for the good. I think that if you look in clinicaltrials.gov, you will see thousands of clinical trials, but maybe even more importantly than that, you'll see hundreds of clinical trials that are in phase 3. So one thing is for certain is that all those trials won't succeed, but many will. And so there's a tsunami of clinical research which will translate into therapies that will reach patients. So that's one phenomenon that's really dynamic. The second thing is that the technologies that are on the market now are really in the process of changing the standard of care. If you look at Organogenesis, we've treated about 400,000 patients, and right now we've reached the stage where one of our tissue engineering cell therapies are applied to patients about once every 1 or 2 minutes in the US, Monday to Friday. So you can imagine if you have a cellular 3-dimensional construct that takes 3 weeks to grow, and yet it's being applied on a patient every 60 or 100 seconds, the type of industrialization that is required to meet the demand. And I think it's that term, the industrialization of the field, that is really starting to take effect as these therapies are no longer investigational, but they're well documented in patient guidelines, treatment guidelines, as either first or second line therapy. The demand is really skyrocketing, and so that's a phenomena that 5 or 10 years ago was more aspirational, whereas now it's a reality. And then the third element is, with the clinical success and the business success of some of the early players, you're starting to see not just sort of interest from a distance from big pharma and medical device companies, but some of these big multinational companies are putting their money where their mouth is. And I think that perhaps the acquisition of Advanced Biohealing by Shire a few months ago for $750 million is actually a very good signal to the field that when technologies are proven and when they've reached the commercial stage, these companies are willing to make big investments.
And so you mentioned obviously industrialization. Could we talk about the logistics of scale up for a lot of therapies? Is it realistic to think that these therapies could be mass produced?
So I think it's always been a theoretical question mark. I think it's very, very relevant that products like Apligraf now are mass produced, and that if you step back and you look at what Apligraph is, it's not just simply cells put in a suspension or cryopreserved and shipped out. It's a three-dimensional construct with two different living human cell types, and that these two cells crosstalk and interact, and as I mentioned earlier, take 3 weeks to really grow. And so this is perhaps the most complex cellular-based tissue engineered product that is available, and yet what we've been able to demonstrate is that we can mass produce it. So, and that the interesting thing about Apligraph is that we've extended the shelf life to 15 days, but at day 15, there's a 90% cell viability with all of the histological release criteria intact. And so as a proof of concept, I would think that we've demonstrated that complex, living, viable, cell-based tissue engineered products can be mass produced and can be shipped around the country and the world in a convenient way. The metric that we hold to ourselves against is 99.7% of the time when a customer orders our tissue engineered construct by 5 p.m. today, we can get it anywhere in the US by 8 a.m. tomorrow. So that's by leveraging the proven efficacy of the FedEx, UPS, DHL networks.
How do tissue engineering companies make themselves more attractive to investors?
Because investors is a broad word, there certainly are some venture capitalists which have an appetite for more risk and for early stage, but in the economic environment today, I think most would acknowledge that that's a bit of a barren land right now. Is that the challenge that we face is that early stage, pre-human phase 1, phase 2 data, it's difficult to find those investors, and so I'll come back to that. But I think once you've demonstrated phase 2, phase 3 data, there seems to be a greater appetite for investment, whether it's VCs or whether it's strategic takeouts, and that there's a growing number of examples of good, solid investment once your scientific foundation has been demonstrated in humans. For the earlier stage, because of the lack of investment from conventional sources, I think one of the phenomena that's emerged in tissue engineering are what's called translational centers. And one of the most exciting new ones is CCRM in Toronto, the Center for Commercialization. But there are a handful that already exist in the US, and I know that there's a big bid out in the UK right now for establishing a center of excellence, or perhaps a consortium of excellence. And I think that what these translational centers will do is fill the gap where conventional investment is lacking, and hopefully that will be a way that small companies can collaborate with these translational centers to advance the technology to the point where some of the more traditional sources of capital are willing to come in when it's been de-risked a little bit.
Kind of touched on the future. Is there any other comments you'd like to make about that, the future of your company and the field in general?
Well, so the future with our company, we believe, is very bright.
Yeah.
And what we challenge ourselves with is to maintain the discipline to keep the focus that has led to our success. And the interesting thing is we have 3 assets in aggressive development right now: Apligraph, Celtics, and VCT01. And ironically, when we were a fraction of the size that we were now, we had 4 or 5 assets. So right now we have 500 employees, and we have revenue last year that exceeded $100 million. And yet I think what we're learning is that for a company at our size, maybe migrating from small to medium, we really don't think we have the wherewithal to actively develop more than 1, 2, or 3 assets at the time. So we believe that we will continue to be successful by maintaining the discipline of saying we induce soft tissue to regenerate via allogeneic cell therapies, and to very carefully identify clinical applications within that remit, and to aggressively develop our existing technology platform to demonstrate safety, efficacy, tolerability.
So how do you go about attracting late stage investments, and how is that different from early stage investments?
Well, so in the lieu of attracting investors for early stage companies, I think it's the translational centers.
Yeah.
I think for a company that's later in the life cycle, such as ours, we, especially in this economic abyss externally, I think we have the good fortune of not only being revenue generating, but having a positive EBITDA, meaning we're a profitable company, so we can live within our own means. So we don't have to go outside for capital. So within our 5-year plan, which we've just recently re-updated, we believe that we can meet our own goals of continuing to make Apligraf a standard of care in the US market, open up global markets, successfully launch the first cell therapy in dentistry, which is before the FDA right now. The phase 1, 2, 3 development has happened, and we're going to panel in November actually for that with FDA. But then importantly, the last goal in our 5-year plan is to continue to build the unique skill sets to make tissue engineering regenerative medicine a success. So those skill sets range from applied research to scale-up manufacturing to commercialization. So we're focused on Apligraf, Celtix, VCT01, but we're really using them as a platform to build the skill sets behind them so that we can entrench ourselves as a very significant player in this field as the field grows.